$315 trillion. That's the total debt of every nation on Earth. The United States alone carries 38 trillion. Japan, 9 trillion. But here's the question no one asks. If the entire world is drowning in debt, who exactly holds the rope on the other end? The answer will disturb you. Because when you trace the chain of creditors, when you follow the money back to its source, you discover something impossible. The world doesn't owe money to anyone in particular. It owes money to itself. And 4 men, across 3 centuries, engineered it that way. This isn't theory, this is architecture. 4 bankers, 4 decisions, each one locking governments deeper into a system where debt can never be repaid, where interest flows eternally upward, and where escape became mathematically impossible. By the end of this, you'll understand why 38 trillion isn't a mistake. It's the machine working exactly as designed. Before 1694, debt was simple. Kings borrowed from merchants. They promised repayment with interest. If they couldn't pay, they defaulted. Creditors lost money. The system reset. It was risky. It was messy. But it cleared. William Paterson changed everything. He was a Scottish merchant, failed ventures, grand ambitions. In 1691, he had an idea that would reshape civilization. England was at war with France. King William III needed money desperately. The treasury was empty. Traditional lenders were refusing loans because England had defaulted before. Paterson approached the king with a proposal. He would organize wealthy merchants to lend the government £1.2 million, roughly 300 million today. Colossal sum. But here's the innovation. The loan would never be repaid. Instead, the government would pay 8% interest annually. Forever. And to manage this arrangement, Paterson proposed creating a new institution. The Bank of England. The mechanics were revolutionary. Merchant lenders would deposit their gold into the Bank of England. The bank would lend it to the government. The government would pay interest from tax revenue, and the bank would distribute that interest to the lenders. But the principal never touched. The loan was permanent. Why would merchants accept this? Because the interest payment was guaranteed by Parliament, backed by the government's power to tax its citizens. As long as England could collect taxes, the interest would flow, and the banknotes the lenders received could be traded like currency. Better than currency, because they paid interest. Parliament approved the scheme in 1694. For the first time in history, national debt became permanent. Not a problem to solve, a feature of the system. Here's what they don't tell you. The government paid £96,000 per year in interest. Forever. The merchants had bought an annuity from the nation itself. As long as England existed, the money flowed, but Paterson's real genius was what came next. The Bank of England was given the right to issue banknotes, backed by the government's debt. They could print paper money up to the value of the loan. This created money out of debt. The government's IOU became currency. Debt and money were now the same thing. Within 50 years, every major European power copied the model. France, the Netherlands, and by 1790, the newly independent United States. Alexander Hamilton explicitly modeled America's financial system on the Bank of England. Permanent debt, interest paid from taxes, bonds traded as currency. Paterson died in 1719, not particularly wealthy. But the system he built, it's still here. 331 years later, the Bank of England still exists. British government debt has never been paid off. It's been refinanced, rolled over, expanded but never eliminated. The trap was set. Paterson built the foundation. But the trap wasn't complete, not yet. It needed to become global, interconnected, inescapable. That's where the second architect enters. By the early 1800s, European governments had embraced debt. They borrowed for wars, for infrastructure, for operating expenses. But there was no organized market. Each loan was negotiated individually. Interest rates varied wildly. Nathan Rothschild changed that. He industrialized sovereign debt. The Rothschild family started as money changers in Frankfurt. By 1800, the 5 Rothschild brothers had established banking houses in 5 major cities: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna. This network was unprecedented. They could move money across borders faster than anyone. Nathan Rothschild, based in London, was the strategic genius. During the Napoleonic Wars, Nathan arranged loans for Britain, but his innovation wasn't just lending, it was structuring. Instead of lending directly, he bought government bonds at a discount and resold them to investors at a markup. He created a secondary market. The government got money fast. Rothschild collected the spread. Investors got a tradable asset. But here's where it gets darker. In 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo, Nathan learned of Napoleon's defeat before anyone else in London. His courier network was faster than official channels. He used this information to manipulate the bond market. First, he sold British bonds signaling defeat. Prices collapsed. Other investors panicked and sold. Then, after prices crashed, Rothschild bought massive quantities at rock-bottom prices. When news of British victory arrived the next day, bond prices surged. Rothschild made millions not from insider trading as we'd call it today, but from controlling information and timing. This established the Rothschild model. Control the information, control the issuance, control the market. By 1820, the Rothschilds dominated European sovereign debt. If a government needed to borrow, they went through the Rothschilds, because the Rothschilds controlled the investor network. They had the distribution, they set the terms. Here's why this matters for the trap. Before Rothschild, governments could theoretically refuse to pay. If a king defaulted, his creditors lost money. The system reset, but Rothschild made sovereign debt tradable across borders. A British bond might be owned by a French investor who sold it to a German bank, who used it as collateral for a loan to an Austrian aristocrat. The web of ownership became so complex that defaulting wasn't just refusing one creditor. It was collapsing an entire international financial network. This is the Rothschild innovation. Make debt so interconnected that default becomes impossible, not because governments are responsible, but because default would trigger systemic collapse. Governments became trapped. They had to keep paying, and they had to keep borrowing to pay the interest on old debts. The debt trap was no longer just permanent. It was inescapable. The Rothschild family wealth peaked in the mid-1800s. They were the richest family in the world, richer than any king, and that wealth came from one source: interest on sovereign debt. They didn't produce anything. They didn't build anything. They lent money to governments and collected interest. Forever. Paterson made debt permanent. Rothschild made it global. But there was still a limit. Banks only had so much money to lend. The third architect removed that limit entirely. By 1900, America was becoming an economic powerhouse, but it had a primitive financial system. Banks operated independently. Money supply was tied to gold. There was no central mechanism to manage debt. J.P. Morgan fixed that not for the public good, but to protect his banking empire. In 1907, there was a financial panic. Stock prices crashed. Banks failed. The economy seized up. Morgan personally organized a bailout. He gathered the major New York bankers in his library, locked the doors, and forced them to pledge their own money to stabilize failing banks. It worked. The panic ended. Morgan became the de facto central banker of America. But he was 70 years old. He knew he couldn't do it again. So Morgan and his associates designed a permanent solution. They needed a central bank. But Americans hated central banks. The first and second banks of the United States had been shut down by populist opposition, so they disguised it. In 1910, Morgan's associates held a secret meeting on Jekyll Island, Georgia. For 9 days, they designed what would become the Federal Reserve System. The meetings were secret because they knew if the public found out that bankers were designing the nation's monetary system, there would be riots. The plan was brilliant political manipulation. The Federal Reserve wouldn't be called a central bank. It would be called a system. It wouldn't be one institution. It would be 12 regional banks. It wouldn't be controlled by Wall Street. It would be overseen by a board appointed by the president. It looked decentralized, democratic, public, but the structure ensured banker control. The regional Federal Reserve banks were privately owned by member banks. Those banks elected the boards, and the most important power, the power to create money and buy government bonds, was given to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, controlled by the largest Wall Street banks. Morgan's banks. The Federal Reserve Act passed Congress in December 1913. Immediately, the debt trap expanded. Now, the government didn't just borrow from banks. It borrowed from the Federal Reserve, which could create money to buy bonds. Unlimited demand for government debt. Here's why this matters. Before the Federal Reserve, there was a limit to how much the government could borrow. Banks only had so much money to lend, but the Federal Reserve could create money by purchasing government bonds. The government issues a bond. The Fed buys it with newly created money. The government spends the money, and the debt goes on the Fed's balance sheet, backed by nothing but the promise that taxpayers will service it forever. This is the mechanism that enables infinite debt. The Federal Reserve ensures there's always a buyer for government bonds. Always demand. So the government never has to stop borrowing. It can roll over debt forever because the Fed will always buy it. Morgan died in 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve was created. But his legacy is the structure that makes the current $38 trillion in U.S. debt possible. Without the Federal Reserve, the government couldn't borrow at this scale. But with the Fed as a guaranteed buyer, there's no limit. The debt trap became infinite. Paterson made it permanent. Rothschild made it global. Morgan made it infinite. But one final innovation remained the mechanism that would make escape impossible, even when countries couldn't pay. By the 1970s, the debt trap was functioning globally. Every developed nation borrowed, rolled over debt, paid interest. But developing nations were different. They borrowed for infrastructure, and many couldn't keep up payments. Paul Volcker made it permanent. Volcker was Federal Reserve Chairman from 1979 to 1987. He faced a problem. Inflation was over 10%. U.S. credibility was eroding. He needed to stop inflation, even if it meant causing a recession. So in 1979, Volcker raised interest rates dramatically. The federal funds rate went from 11% to 20%, the highest in American history. This crushed inflation, but it had another effect. Developing nations had borrowed billions in dollars during the 1970s when rates were low. Now those loans were due, and the interest rates had tripled. Mexico owed $80 billion. Brazil, $60 billion. Argentina, $40 billion. And they couldn't pay. The interest alone exceeded their export revenues. In August 1982, Mexico announced it couldn't make payments. Default. This should have triggered global financial collapse. American banks had lent most of that money. If Mexico defaults as Citibank, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, all would take massive losses. Some might fail. Volcker could have let it happen. Let the banks take losses. Let the market clear, but he didn't. Instead, he orchestrated a bailout through the International Monetary Fund. The IMF would lend Mexico, Brazil, Argentina enough money to keep making interest payments to American banks. The loans came with conditions. Brutal conditions. Governments had to cut spending, privatize state assets, open markets to foreign investments, devalue currencies, basically dismantle their economic sovereignty in exchange for the money to keep paying interest. And here's the key. The IMF loans didn't reduce debt. They just rolled it over. Made it manageable, but permanent. This is the Volcker innovation. When debt becomes unpayable, don't forgive it. Restructure it. Lend enough to keep interest payments flowing and extract political concessions in exchange. The debt trap became a tool of control. Countries that couldn't pay were forced to open their economies, sell their assets, and submit to foreign economic policy in exchange for the privilege of staying in debt. This pattern has repeated for 40 years. Greece in 2010, Argentina in 2001, Sri Lanka in 2022. Every time, the same structure. IMF loans to keep paying interest. Austerity imposed. Sovereignty surrendered. And the debt never eliminated, just restructured, made perpetual. Volcker died in 2019. But his legacy is the mechanism that ensures the debt trap is global and inescapable. Even when countries can't pay, they're not allowed to default. They're refinanced into permanent indebtedness, and the interest keeps flowing to the creditors. The same banks, the same institutions, the same system Paterson created in 1694. 4 architects, 3 centuries, 1 system. Paterson made debt permanent in 1694. Rothschild made it global in 1815. Morgan made it infinite in 1913. Volcker made it inescapable in 1982. Together, they built a system where governments borrow forever and pay interest eternally. And the people who control the bonds, who manage the debt, who collect the interest, they're the ultimate beneficiaries. Not governments, not taxpayers. The financial institutions. Here's the final truth. 38 trillion isn't a crisis for them. It's a business model. Every dollar of debt is an asset on someone's balance sheet. It pays interest. It provides collateral for more borrowing. And as long as confidence holds, as long as people believe the government will pay interest, even if it never repays principal, the system functions. The debt trap is complete, and escape isn't possible. Not without collapsing the entire financial system. 4 architects. 3 centuries. 1 trap, and everyone on Earth is now caught inside it.